Hello everyone and welcome to this RAF Museum lecture. I'm Dr. Harry Rafal. I'm just going to bring myself onto centre stage. I'm Dr. Harry Rafal. I'd like to thank you all for joining us. We've got a fantastic turnout tonight. We've had 500 people registered to be here with us. And we are being joined by people from Northwest Colombia, South Korea, and even East London. So wherever you're joining us from, thank you very much for being here. Today's speaker is Chris Rogers. Chris is an independent researcher who's published on a number of architectural topics and has also previously studied the experiences of No.8401 Disarming Wing. And today he's going to talk about Taming eels, disarming the Luftwaffe, 1945 to 48. So without any further ado, I'm going to bring Chris onto the stage. Turn his camera back on and his mic. Okay, Chris, you're with us. Do you want to take us away?
Thank you. It's 1913. And we are looking down on the seaside resort of Travemünde on Germany's Baltic coast, 60 miles northeast of Hamburg and downriver from Lübeck, the Hanseatic town of which it is a suburb. At the top is Travemünde proper, with its casino, grand hotels and beach. At the bottom is Priwall, the peninsula across the river mouth where the town's racecourse can be found, and where this year construction work is starting on an airport. Seaplanes and flying boats already use the bay. Note that large hangar at the top, which we will encounter later. And by the 1920s, international mail, freight and passenger services are being flown to destinations as distant as the Canary Islands, attracting to Travemünde-Priwall the nickname Aerial Crossroads of the North. The airport hosted air shows, demonstrations and races. Future designers Anthony Fokker and Ernst Heinkel worked in the aviation firms based at Priwall, and advanced and radical aircraft could be seen there. But those same firms were already assisting the Weimar Republic's covert rearmament program, and the entire site was sold to the government even before the National Socialists came to power in 1933. A year after that event, civil aviation at Travemünde stopped, public access was prohibited, and Travemünde-Priwall became a military proving ground, or E-Stelle, for the new Luftwaffe, one of 4 such centres, all clustered in the northeast of the country. It specialised in seaplanes and flying boats, building on that civilian past, but much other work was undertaken there as well. In the summer of 1936, prototype aircraft from 4 rival firms arrived for the competitive evaluation phase of trials to select a new fighter for the Luftwaffe, replacing its Great War era biplanes. 3 of those prototypes were made by Arado, Focke-Wulf and Heinkel. That engineer now headed his own firm, but the winner was from another designer, Willy Messerschmitt. This is the V5 prototype of Messerschmitt's Bf 109, which was tested at Travemünde, and it still shows its civilian registration. All 4 aircraft were flown against each other in simulated dogfights, and the winner was, of course, the 109. It was revealed to the public just a few weeks later at the Berlin Olympics, but Travemünde itself would remain classified for the next 10 years. During that time, the world again went to war, and only in the final days of that conflict would the secrets of Travemünde and those of the Luftwaffe be revealed. It's the 3rd of May, 1945. British and American forces moving east and Russian troops moving west meet at Wismar, just a few dozen miles along the coast from Travemünde. Positive images such as this, signalling the imminent and hard-fought end to hostilities, belied a reality of mutual suspicion and contradictory goals amongst those same allies. Agreed lines of advance were already blurred. Both were angling to seize the other's territory, and things came to a head later that same week when a US journalist leaked news of Germany's formal surrender before proper Soviet agreement had been obtained, forcing a premature declaration of the end of hostilities for the 8th of May. The resentment this created in Russia drove a second surrender that evening and meant that to this day, she pointedly marks VE Day 24 hours after the rest of Europe. But given that end had been in sight for some time, the Royal Air Force had begun planning back in February to locate and dispose of the aircraft, ordnance and equipment of the Luftwaffe, setting up 10 dedicated disarmament wings, initially drawn from existing personnel, with an initial expected strength of 3,000 airmen in total. For many of those airmen, this would be their first posting abroad. Weeks, months, or years earlier, they had arrived at recruit centres in England with suitcase, letter, and final civilian pay packet, ready to receive their identity discs, swear allegiance to the king, and don uniform. No longer could the barrow boy be distinguished from the city gent, as one put it. After 6 weeks of assessment and instruction, they were posted to often isolated camps, described as places of mud, rusting nissen huts, and breakfasts consisting of a wisp of bacon, a scrape of margarine, and brown tea. Amongst those preparing such fare was my father, pictured here in the front row, fourth from left. A butcher's assistant from North London, he had lied about his age, enlisted in the RAF VR at 17, and trained as a cook once his 18th birthday had arrived. After a year guarding radar stations around the coast, he was assigned to No. 8401 Air Disarmament Wing and reported to RAF Kenley near Croydon on the 20th of April 1945, Hitler's final birthday. My father was one of 300 men billeted there and at the nearby Marden Park country estate, awaiting deployment to the continent. Weapons training and ordnance disposal practice followed, along with inoculations and lectures on technical equipment, the correct way to employ an interpreter, and the booby traps that might be encountered abroad. Every airman, no matter what their trade, would be armed. Sten submachine guns, rifles, and revolvers were distributed. On the 6th of May 1945, No. 8401 Wing left in a convoy of nearly 40 vehicles for Tilbury Docks in Essex, driving through South London, crossing London Bridge, and camping overnight at RAF Hornchurch to await a passage. At 0400 hours on the 7th of May 1945, No. 840 Wing's advance party, which included my father, embarked either on a requisitioned civilian ferry or a military landing craft like this for Ostend in Belgium. The Wing's diary notes that lifebelts were issued together with a paper vomit bag, although fortunately the crossing was recorded as calm. It's unlikely any of the men knew that even earlier that morning, the war in Europe had ended with the signing of that initial formal surrender at Reims. Here we see Supreme Commander Eisenhower holding the pens used in a V for Victory sign. 8401 Wing drove more than 500 miles in the next week through Western Europe, passing through Ghent, Antwerp, and Arnhem, which Canadian broadcasting correspondent Matthew Halton called a deserted burning shell. A British Army War Diary entry said that of Arnhem that a town had never been more wantonly destroyed. My father described it as still burning and filled with starving civilians. The Wing's destination was Fuhlsbüttel, an airfield on the outskirts of Hamburg, but the buildings when they arrived were found, quote, looted, partially destroyed, incredibly dirty, and not in a fit state for occupation. The Wing thus spent their first night in Hamburg, camped out on the airfield runways, before looking for new accommodation the following morning. They found that at Uetersen, another Luftwaffe airfield nearby, which would remain the Wing's base for the duration of its mission in northeastern Germany. Excuse me. The Wing would split into 3 squadrons, assigned to different areas, which were drawn in blue on this map, which is an original that I found attached to their war diary at the National Archives in Kew. Orders were headed secret even at this stage, and the Wings would sometimes work with T-Force, the independent cross-service unit, whose sole aim was to locate and exploit German technology and scientists, a slightly different goal from the RAF disarmament wings themselves. In this context, it's notable, however, that the briefings to disarmament wing officers back in England, covering that range of subjects that I mentioned, also included lectures by Derek Garrard, who worked alongside the famed Professor R.V. Jones, Assistant Director Intelligence Science in MI6. For my father's squadron, number 2, the principal target was the Luftwaffe Stelle at Travemünde that we saw earlier. It had been seized on the same day as that Wismar meeting by a British Army reconnaissance squadron, whose armoured cars sealed the long neck leading to the Priwall Peninsula to prevent looting, sabotage, or escape. Its commander then co-opted French prisoners of war, soldiers from the Steller's barracks, and local police to deal with the flow of refugees, who were fleeing not the Americans already, the Germans already there, but the Russian army advancing from the east. More British troops and American forces arrived at the Eastella soon afterwards. This photograph shows the 11th Armoured Brigade on the quayside at Travemünde. And only then was the true scale and work of the Eastella unit able to be examined. The heart of the Eastella complex was the administration building, seen in this damaged photo that was found in my father's papers, which itself is a very interesting historical item. It was an original print that was clearly taken after the Allied occupation. If you look carefully, you can see the white-starred US Jeeps and the British trucks. And very careful examination seems to suggest there may have been a fire or something at that administration building at the time, which is perhaps why the image was taken. However, in wartime, from that block, a vast campus of hangars, engine sheds, and workshops, around 1,400 staff and 700 forced labourers, was controlled and directed towards a wide range of tasks. The Eastella at Travemünde worked on navigation and communication equipment for the Luftwaffe, different types of fuels, devices to start aero engines, rescue and life-saving gear, particularly with reference to life-saving on the water, and machines to create obscuring fog and smoke. It also developed all of the aircraft and the complete operational doctrine for the Kriegsmarine's first carrier air wing, until that project was abandoned late in the war. The only carrier to have construction started was the Graf Zeppelin, and that work never finished. But Travemunde's work continued right up till the end of the war, and that included conducting catapult launches of a navalised version of the ME-109T, which you see here, from a barge in the bay. It also conducted trials, landing trials of the ME-109 and other navalised aircraft using electric and hydraulic arrestor wire systems on a simulated carrier deck built on dry land. The Eastella also created the official camouflage atlas of colours and patterns to be applied to every Luftwaffe aircraft, from transports flying in desert sunlight to night fighters hunting in Europe. The Eastella's primary role during the war, however, was to evaluate every make and model of amphibious aircraft flown by Germany's armed forces. And it's worth pointing out here that although the Kriegsmarine operated the majority of the flying boats, they were all crewed by the Luftwaffe, even on the Kriegsmarine's aircraft. We see a good example here, a Blohm & Voss BV-138 Sea Dragon, one of the most common types of amphibious aircraft used by the German forces during the war. It was built at the Blohm & Voss works at Hamburg, and there's a very clear and intimate connection between Blohm & Voss's work in Hamburg and the work that carried on at Travemünde. And this is reflected in the work of the Disarmament Wing. For all of the aircraft tested at Travemünde, an Auftrag or assignment, similar to that seen on the left, was produced. And the aim of the program was to establish each aircraft's flight characteristics, operational limits, and recommended flying regime. It was an extremely detailed program that was illustrated, instrumented, recorded on film, still, and moving camera film. And there were a range of facilities at the base in order to assist, including the crane that we see here. This one was erected on the quayside of the Eastella. There was another crane mounted in a ship for recovery work in the bay. The BV-138, as I say, is a very common example of a medium-sized amphibious aircraft that was tested and perfected at Travemünde. But even the hangar seen in my first slide, which was the largest of its type in Europe when it was built in 1926-27, would have struggled to accommodate the largest aircraft that was tested at Travemünde, which was the Blohm & Voss BV-222 Viking. It had 6 engines, a wingspan of 150 feet, and an overall length of 120 feet. It was, in fact, the largest operational flying boat of the war. There were 13 built. Most were lost in action, but at least one was found at Travemünde by No.8401 Wing. My father specifically recalled seeing an example partially sunk, and that aligns with sources telling of a scuttling or strafing attack on the BV-222 there. This image shows one on land at Travemünde, the left-hand image, dwarfing a Focke-Wulf FW-190. The hull of another was encountered at the Blommenbos Works in Hamburg, and we see that here in the right-hand picture. And you should be able to see the men in the bottom corner, which provide a sense of scale. The actual story of the BV-222 is extremely complicated. For various reasons, it's proven very difficult to establish the final resting places of all 13 aircraft. Many sources are quite contradictory, but it's certainly the case that at least one was found at Travemünde. Indeed, what was interesting is that so important were all of the amphibious aircraft that were found by number 8401 Wing, that Sir John Buchanan, who was the Director General of Aircraft Production during the war, and immediately afterwards was appointed Technical Director of Short Brothers, one of Britain's main amphibious aircraft manufacturers, and Air Vice Marshal Ray Griffith Parry of the RAF, both visited and stayed with the wing for several days in the autumn of 1945 to write an intelligence report on the airframes and the manufacturing facilities that were found in the area. And it was immediately clear that even at this early stage, the equipment that the RAF disarmament wing was finding was superior in many respects to that was available in England, even in specialist manufacturers like Short Brothers. And we'll see more of that as we go through the story. Although amphibious aircraft were the raison d'etre of Travemünde, many other notable aircraft were discovered there by 8401 Wing, reflecting the specialism of the Stelle, but also Blommenbos. Blommenbos was a shipmaker that has a very prestigious history. It used to construct ships of all kinds, but it started to branch out into aviation in the 1930s. Firstly, it was assembling other people's aircraft under license, and then it started to design its own. And it's very interesting to see that even at that stage that the RAF found examples of some of the work that they did. So in July 1945, a very rare Focke-Wulf 190 torpedo carrier, you should just be able to see the belly clamps underneath the aircraft, was found at Priwall. It was tested there, and once it was secured, it was flown northwest to Schleswig by a German pilot under British escort, and it was then forwarded to RAE Farnborough in England, where it was later tested by Royal Navy pilot Eric Brown, who many of you will be familiar with. In common with a lot of the aircraft, even the unusual ones, it was actually scrapped a few years later in 1950. However, in Hamburg, the wing also found something else rather interesting and very specific to Blommenbos. It secured the only 3 examples built, some of which were at varying stages of assembly, of the Blommenbos BV-155. It was an experimental high-altitude interceptor. It was begun by Messerschmitt, but taken over by Blommenbos. And it was a quite extraordinary aircraft. It featured a turbocharger, a supercharger, and a pressurized cockpit. It was specifically designed to fly at an extremely high operational ceiling. Its maximum ceiling was 50,000 feet. And of the 3 examples that the RAF captured, the sole remaining example is now part of the Smithsonian collection in Washington. And it's been identified in recent research as effectively the last aircraft that Blommenbos ever built. Those 2 aircraft were rare, but one unique aircraft that was found at Priwall was this. At first glance, it looks a little bit like a toy, perhaps. It was the FTP-227. And if you look closely, although the engines are only partially installed, you can see that it's a 6-engine vehicle, not much bigger than a Mosquito, but it is in fact a 5th scale test bed for a much, much larger aircraft. It was built to test the characteristics of a planned flying boat called the BV-238, which was bigger even than the BV-222. Only one was ever built, and it was tested on the Schalsee, which is a lake just outside Travemunde's area. But it was caught on the water, on the open water, and destroyed by Allied fighters late in the war. And quite impressively, my father's squadron discovered its remains on the Schalsee when they were exploring the area, and that's recorded in the operational diary. So those are 3 examples, unusual examples, of the aircraft that were discovered just in 8401 area alone. All told, it's reckoned that several thousand aircraft in flyable condition across the range of types that Germany employed were secured across Germany. Many of those were left in place, but an awful lot were taken to England for evaluation. Some of them were put on show to the public, initially in Hyde Park in the summer of 1945, and then later in the autumn of 1945 in a much larger exhibition at RAE Farnborough. And this is a really excellent picture of the open aircraft park of that exhibition. As you can see, it featured a plethora of aeronautical advances, including jet and rocket-powered aircraft, and the V1 and the V2. And I think, bearing that in mind, it must have seemed rather like a Flash Gordon serial come to life for the public who came to see it. Amongst the less exciting but still important ancillary equipment that was shown at that exhibition were aircraft instruments, summer weight flying helmets, which are actually quite novel at the time, and ribbon parachutes, which are parachutes of a particular type, far more stable than conventional parachutes, and actually invented in Germany. And we'll hear a little bit more about those later. All three of those types of items were taken directly from No.8401's area in the preceding weeks. They were collecting items, flying them back to England, even in the last couple of weeks before this exhibition took place. And all of that's recorded in the war diary. And you might be able to pick out some of your favourite aircraft there just in this one shot. There are a wide range of other items that my father's squadron alone, bear in mind that was 1 out of 3, found. These were items that were hidden in unlikely places, hidden in barns, in shops, even in an orphanage. And some of the equipment found included truckloads of the Rheintochter surface-to-air missile, and also a high-speed cine camera that was used for ballistics analysis. That item alone was considered important enough to be flown to England with a flight lieutenant from the Disarmament Wing as its own escort. But the aircraft were only part of a much wider technology transfer program undertaken by the Allies that was intended as much to aid their own industrial sectors as it was to deny Germany any future warfighting ability. And that's why a vast range of scientific and manufacturing targets were visited and equipment of every type were removed. The Wing details in its diary its involvement in several targeted sweeps of particular firms and manufacturing institutions in the area, one of which was conducted with T-Force at the Philips subsidiary Valvo's factory in the Hamburg area. This was a factory that produced electronic valves, principally for army radio sets, but also for U-boat radar screens and other similar installations. They produced the cathode ray tubes, which are extremely valuable at the time. And again, as with the Blom and Voss works, it's interesting that the diary records and the analysis that came out of that visit, that there were machines, for example, found at that factory that were of a type not known in Britain. So that is why they were deemed valuable. Another specific goal for the 8401 wing was this, the Hamburg Shipbuilding Research Institute. The buildings on the left still actually exist, quite surprisingly. They've been turned over to other purposes. The manoeuvring basin that you see there is for model ships. That's been concreted in and it's now a public park. Specifically, the wing was there to investigate the Institute's work on cavitation. Cavitation is the formation and collapse of air bubbles underwater, particularly on propellers. And the wing targeted its 2-story high vertical water tunnel. And a water tunnel is like a wind tunnel, except that it has water going through it under pressure rather than wind. And we see a very rare picture of that here. And within that water tunnel, propellers were examined for the effects of cavitation. The wing removed that tunnel, took it back to England. Why was that important? Because cavitation causes vibration and noise and damage, and it's one of the few ways to detect submerged submarines. Today, in the age of nuclear submarines, which are even harder to detect, cavitation is a classified topic, which is why whenever you see pictures of submarines, you never see their propellers and their screws, because it's all about how the cavitation works. So a lot of material was seized and was taken back to England. An awful lot was left behind, and much of the wing's work was involved in concentrating and destroying all of the material that was left behind. That included ordnance, aircraft, engines, other things. It was either scrapped, burned, or dumped at sea, and the rate is quite astonishing. If you look at the 8401 Wing's diary alone, they were dealing with hundreds, sometimes thousands of tons of material every month, and that went on for over a year in the case of 8401 Wing. So there was a vast amount of material that was left in place and then destroyed. But their work didn't just involve hardware, it involved people as well. German experts were also handled, which permitted far more information to be obtained through interrogation than had been available from the small stream of Luftwaffe prisoners and defectors, because some Luftwaffe crews did defect during the war, that were questioned before the end of hostilities. Specifically, number 8401 Wing secured a parachute pioneer called Wilhelm Buss. He was one of the first people to undertake an ejection from an aircraft. He was testing that facility in a Heinkel HE219 Uhu, and you see that test vehicle here on the left. He was a parachute instructor, and he was one of the principal instructors and trainers in parachute use for the whole of the Luftwaffe. He was found by the wing, and he was sent in cooperative mood back to England, where he was questioned at the interrogation centre that was set up at Beltane School in Wimbledon. As late as the second half of 1946, over 200 German scientists and other fingers were still being detained at Wimbledon, where they were interrogated. Buss told of his testing of parachutes intended for escaping from aircraft. He relayed details of the speeds and heights from which he deployed his canopy. And in May 1946, that information led to an intelligence report, one of many that were produced, into the subject. That also explains how parachutes for retarding aerial dropped mines and bombs were assessed at Travemünde using those ribbon parachutes that I mentioned earlier. What's particularly interesting in light of the specific location of Travemünde is that Buss returned to Germany months after his interrogation, and he was specifically sent into what was now the Russian zone of occupation in order to secure his documents for the British, not for the Russians. And the diary contains a number of entries as they track his progress. And finally, however, they were forced to record that when he eventually arrived at his destination, all of the documents had been found and already removed by the Russians. So unfortunately, he returned empty-handed. Interestingly, after the war, Buss was relocated to America, and he continued to develop and patent parachute improvements right up to the 1960s, where he lived in California. And on the right here, you see one of his patents that was filed as late as 1961. It was, as noted earlier, fear of the Russians that drove many of the refugees west. There were about 1,000 refugees encountered at Travemünde. They were temporarily housed there, and the RAF had to look after them. As autumn turned to winter, the factory was cleared to allow blankets to be made, and more than 2,000 metal parachute containers were converted into stoves. Theft of food occurred. Cuts in rations, which were already extremely low for the civilian population, were reported to have caused, quote, alarm and adverse comment on the British administration. And lots of petty acts of sabotage were noted, like cutting of telegraph wires and so on. However, staff at one of the RAF's mobile field hospitals, which followed the operational units around during the war, did donate toiletries and cigarettes to support British troops dealing with the inmates of Bergen-Belsen a fortnight after its liberation. And whilst fraternisation between Western forces and Germans was initially banned, rather famously, pragmatism quickly led to successive relaxations. And there's a wonderful reference in the Wing's diary that on Christmas Eve 1945, the Wing held a Christmas dance to which they invited women from a displaced persons camp next door. This is a DP camp at Hamburg, and my father used to talk quite a lot about displaced people, and I think it's quite remarkable that that was done. But although the fighting had finished, there was still danger for the airmen of the RAF's occupation force over the course of their posting. In 8401 Wing alone, their diary records the deaths of 3 men when their vehicle skidded into a tree. 2 more were killed in a bomb disposal explosion. 1 was the victim of what's described as an unfortunate shooting incident, and yet another drowned whilst bathing at Travemünde. and that was just within their area. In the winter of 1945-46, with the Elbe frozen, 5 Germans and 3 Poles escaped from a prisoner of war camp north of Hamburg, leaving a guard dead. There were also injuries caused by ordnance, gunshots, and petrol cookers. The seriously hurt were flown to England. Others were cared for in Germany until they were fit enough to undergo evacuation by sea. But mostly the airmen settled into their new homes, taking advantage of their strange surroundings as best they could, as best as enlisted men have always done. In my father's case, that meant securing a Luger pistol and a pair of high-powered naval binoculars, whilst taking an occasional trip out on the bay in a motor launch. All of them were helping cement the peace with one enemy, but they were doing so just as another began to emerge. And that's symbolized here with an image of Adolf Hitler Street in Trier, Germany, being renamed on the left, and a British serviceman meeting his Soviet counterpart on the right. Russian officers did visit No. 8401 Wing cordially at least once, noted in their diary. But the RAF's airmen found themselves at the intersection of 2 very different fighting forces and 2 very different cultures, kept apart by war but now forced together in peace. Oral testimonies of British servicemen based in and around Travemünde reference Russian abuses of German civilians and the difficulties of intervening in the actions of what is, after all, an ally. But it also discloses British complicity in disobeying repatriation orders and falsifying German papers to allow those fleeing from the east to stay in the west. Interference by Russia in Western operations was not unusual, as we've seen, and it was in March 1946 that Churchill spoke publicly about the Iron Curtain descending across Europe, something that would later have special significance in Travemünde. And that was in the same speech that stressed the special relationship between Germany and the United States. By June 1946, so a year after the end of hostilities, over 8,000 tons of technical equipment had been dispatched to England from across Germany, although sites did now begin to be handed over to the Allied Control Commission, which had been formed to manage the occupation in a civilian sense. At Priwall in the summer of 1946, the peninsula became a convalescent centre for British forces, and the Wing's diary starts to show officers and men demobilising, which effectively reversed the process of recruitment. Having returned to England, they were processed out of the RAF, sometimes at a rate of several hundred a day at certain centres. They re-entered civilian life and were placed on a range of vocational courses, including subjects such as carpentry, home cooking, and even music. Many were still left in Germany, however, and in August 1946, the entirety of the Nazi armed forces was formally dissolved, including the Luftwaffe. And that same month, my father's wing, 8401, finally left Germany, recording in their diary clearance of a total of over 1,000 separate targets in the 15 months that they'd been there. Other wings were still there, and they completed their work over the following months. They were supervised by No. 103 Wing, working in England, in Harrow, in fact, who'd organised all of the dispatch of the original 10 wings, and who themselves started to conclude their work in late 1946. In April 1947, an American financier and presidential advisor called Bernard Baruch gave a speech. He said, quotes, "Let us not be deceived. We are today in the midst of a Cold War. Our enemies are to be found abroad and at home. Let us never forget this. Our unrest is the heart of their success." It was a year later in 1948 that the Soviet blockade of Berlin prompted the year-long Berlin airlift. The Allied Control Commission broke down at the same time when the Soviet representative withdrew. That same year, 1948, the RAF disarmament operation as a whole finally departed Germany. At Priwall, most of the Stelle buildings were demolished and the concrete aprons and the taxiways were torn up. Over the years that followed, local school children were required to plant thousands of saplings on the grass airfield to prevent its use by aviation in the future. Their work made the black triangle that you see on the picture on the left, advancing from the left across the sweep of the field. And that continued for several years. And when I went to Germany to do some research that ended up in this talk, I spoke to a man who remembered doing that when he was a child. The administration block survived and it became a merchant marine college. It was an offshoot of a long-established college that had been established in Hamburg, and it's still running today. One of the barrack blocks was converted into a civilian hospital, which only closed a few years ago. In 1949, NATO was formed after West and then East Germany were declared, a division that was emphasised by the 850 miles of the inner German border. That inner German border was still porous at this stage and was not yet fortified, which is important to remember. But it nevertheless sliced through Germany, and it specifically sliced across the narrow neck of land leading to Priwall, and you can see that very clearly on the left there. That was the same neck of land that was secured by the British Armoured Squadron in 1945. As a result, Priwall and Travemünde proper were now in West Germany, but Pertinitz, which was where the support unit for the East area had been established and is on the other side of that narrow neck of land, was now in East Germany. The legacy of the 3-year disarmament mission across Germany was far-reaching, both personally and organisationally. For my father and the 8,000 airmen who were ultimately involved in the effort, it was to be a store of memories, friends and experiences that they could never have imagined. For the RAF, it was recognition that its responsibilities did not end when the fighting ceased, but neither did its capabilities. Air Chief Marshal Sir Stuart Peach, contemporary historian and serving officer, described the task of disbanding the Luftwaffe as having been completed with efficiency and sensitivity. And I think particularly in today's climate, it's important to recognise that a warfighting unit does have other responsibilities and can adapt to those responsibilities. And in the particular situation of Europe at the end of the last war, it's interesting to see how that was achieved. For Britain, it meant many boosts in areas of advanced technology. Martin Ryle and Bernard Lovell used British radar equipment in some of their radio astronomy work, but they were also supplied with high-quality German radar components to both of their respective organisations. And here we see one of the British bits of equipment that they used, but they were also supplied, as I say, with German equipment as well. Wind tunnel motors and sections of wind tunnels were taken from the German Aeronautical Research Institute at Wolkenrode and used to set up RAE Bedford and other British sites, including a ballistics analysis site at Fort Halstead in Kent. Scientists, again, were employed and brought to England just as the equipment was. An aerodynamicist called Dietrich Kueschemann made significant contributions to the design of Concorde, whilst another aerodynamicist called Hans Multop did the same for the aircraft that became the English Electric Lightning. Historian Andrew Nahum has concluded that German input had a, quote, significant influence, quotes, on British R&D in the post-war period. And that can be traced directly back to the work of the disarmament wings, the equipment and the people that they brought over. For the country that had been the subject of this extraordinary effort, Germany, of course, the legacy went far further than can be properly considered here. It is, though, worth noting the irony of former Luftwaffe pilots and officers being asked by the West German government to form the Bundeswehr's air arm from 1955 onwards. All of them were screened carefully. Many of them were not accepted, but many of them were, including some of the top scoring aces of the war. As for Travemünde-Priwall itself, 6 years after that, in 1961, East Germany declared its entire Baltic coastline a controlled border zone. On the left, we see the intrusion of the now fortified inner German border to cover the beach. The surveillance and control compound that you see there was erected. It included 2 separate control towers, floodlights, and all the usual impedimenta of borders. There was a wire fence barrier along the coastline. There was a chain barrier that went out to sea to indicate the border in the sea itself. And there were patrol boats that were running up and down the water of the coast as well. All of this happened while West Germans looked on from the nudist beach that had been established on Priwall, literally the other side of the wire. So Travemünde-Priwall has a very unique place in the RAF disarmament world, because not only did the men of the RAF conduct a similar nature of operations as was done elsewhere in Germany, but they were uniquely placed to see the end of one war and effectively the start of another. Travemünde-Priwall therefore changed from a gateway to travel around the world to the most northerly point of the ugly boundary that defined the Cold War for the next 50 years. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. I'm just going to give you a quick pause. I'm going to close your slides down as well. Thank you very much for a brilliant talk. We've had some really lovely comments in the comment section, frankly. I really enjoyed it. I should say, when I got your proposal to give this talk, I really wanted to get you in to come do it, because there are usually sort of two types of papers which really catch my attention. Those I already know a lot about, as I really want to know more, and those which I know very little about. And this sort of falls into that category. I remember seeing it and thinking, you know, wow, I'd love to hear more about that, because it's not a topic I know a lot about. And I think that's sort of reflected in a lot of the comments from our audience. They really enjoyed this glimpse into this bit of history. Now, before we go into the Q&A, I'd just like to say to our audience that if you've enjoyed this talk, as so many of you seem to have done, that we will have another one on the 22nd of April with KS Nair, who will discuss the Indian Air Force in the Second World War. And on the 27th of May, Dr. Thomas Withington will discuss how Bomber Command pioneered electronic warfare. So both very good lectures, so I'm looking forward to those as well. But Chris, again, fantastic lecture. We've got some good questions coming already, and for our audience, if you'd like to put questions to Chris, you can use the Ask a Question function at the bottom. But I'm going to start by picking up on one of the very first comments before the lecture even started, from the enthusiastic people who registered early, and it's been put into the question function. It's from David Bennett, who asked about exercise post-mortem. And David, I should say, I'm really interested to read your comments. I'd love to see any more material that you have from your family's experiences. And if you'd like to share it, you can email the RAF Museum at askcollections@rafmuseum.org. But Chris, yeah, David asks, do you know anything more about Operation Post-Mortem?
No, and funny enough, I will have to admit that that is something that I've not been very familiar with. So as I think I replied to David in my earlier comment, I kind of frantically went away today and had a very quick Google, but didn't have a lot of time to take it forward. I think what's interesting about the whole subject is that, as hopefully was kind of hinted at in my talk, that each of those little items that I mentioned is its own kind of world of interest in itself. So I think what's been interesting, just for the couple of comments that people put months ago before the lecture came live, those of us that have fathers and relatives that took part in this, I think, find our interest piqued by it. And whether you're interested particularly in the operational side, the technical side, the humanitarian side, as I tried to bring out in the lecture, and as my dad certainly mentioned, or in the political side as well, I think, you know, there's something for everyone to dig further into. And I think what I tried to show in the piece is that this was a completely encompassing operation. And I think for obvious reasons, many people are focused on the war fighting and the operational aspects of that. And I think what attracted me particularly, apart from the fact obviously that my father was involved, was the fact that it was an absolutely unique moment, because it was, you know, the war doesn't stop and everyone goes home neatly and forgets everything. And I think it was so interesting to see that there was this sustained effort. This wasn't just something that was done in a couple of months. It wasn't over by Christmas. I mean, my father's wing spent over a year there. That is an awful long time just in one small area. So yeah, it's not something that I've come across, but as with a lot of the things that I think that I've encountered on this, it makes me want to go away myself and do, as you've said, try and find out a bit more about it.
Yeah, it sounds like a fascinating topic. So this is more on 8401 Wing. It's from Ellie Tony, and they are asked, were there any French or American liaison officers with the wing?
Ah, well, that's interesting, because One of the things that's been a bit frustrating looking through the operational records books is that you get lots and lots of, they're very specific in some areas, which is great, and that's really helpful. Frustratingly less so in others. So there was certainly lots of visits from, well, there were kind of two sorts of visits. There was lots of inter-squadron and inter-wing liaison, as you might expect. So, and I think reflecting the time and perhaps reflecting the hierarchical nature of the RAF, as with most armed forces, there's lots of very detailed information about which flying officer went where, which squadron commander went where, and that's very helpful. Where it kind of breaks down is where you get people from other branches of the armed forces or other allies. So the reference that I made to the Russian visit, that was perfectly clearly logged. There were lots of VIPs that came over, and I think that's another thing that's quite interesting. There was pretty much a constant stream of senior VIPs. Sholto Douglas came over and visited at least once. AVM Tedder came over and visited at least once. Parry, as I've mentioned. There were no specific references to other allied nations, which I suspect must, at least to a degree, reflect the immediate post-war split between the French, the American zone, and so on. So no, there were no specific references, and I did go through the whole thing, and there is a lot of it, but there were no specific references to that. I think what's been interesting is when you see there was more, and there may be another question, so I don't want to anticipate it too much, but there are references to German administrative individuals. Some of those, again, are quite hard to sort of dig down in terms of detail. But yeah, nothing specific to those two countries, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's sort of that period where there's sort of quite a lot of jealous guarding of the secrets which are being captured, isn't it?
There is, and I think, and that when you look further, whether you look at, I mean, most people probably have heard of Operation Paperclip. There was Operation Lusty as well, which was a brilliant pseudo acronym for Luftwaffe secret technology. There was, I didn't mention it in the lecture, but there was BIOS, which was the British Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, which R.V. Jones was on. And there was a lot of that. I mean, some of the work that I've referenced, Andrew Nahum's work, some other researchers have looked at that. And what's interesting now, you kind of almost think there isn't much more to say about this, but actually there is, because I think a lot of research kind of stopped at when VE Day happens. And what's been interesting now is you've got different generations of researchers that are coming back, partly looking obviously at post-1991 archives, but also looking at how things were seen through certain filters at the time. So the things that were secret at the time are sort of less secret now. Nuances that were kind of missed at the time or not really appreciated are now, you know, looked at in different ways. So yeah, that's why the bus story was so interesting. I thought that was fantastic as a find. He wasn't the only German expert that was referenced in the ORB. It was the most easily traceable one. I've noticed in some of the excellent comments, and can I just say now, thank you so much for your comments. It's quite remarkable. The bus story is so interesting because there was a fair amount of information that you can trace through. So you can find what happened to him. You can see how he moved, picking up your point, Harry, about moving from supplying information to the Brits to supplying information to the Americans, and then that fascinating story. And it's such a sad little entry in the diary when it says Dr. Buss has returned. Unfortunately, the material has already been taken by the Russians. And they found that even when they looked at Hamburg, they looked at the Blom Voss works, they looked at other things, and all the interesting stuff had already been nicked. So the question about the American ones actually was interesting because there were a couple of ones, I'd need to reference it, but there are a couple of places where all of the choice hardware had already been pinched, and the Americans were doing it to the Brits, just like the Russians were as well.
Yeah, definitely get the inside track if you can. So one of the questions which has been heavily voted on is whether the British captured any top secret plans or research and development for further development of jet fighters, and if so, were these used commercially by various British aircraft manufacturers? I think you touched on this.
Yes, I think would be the answer. In terms of the ORBs, you have to kind of read between the lines a lot. So there are lots of, because you have to remember that the operational record books were usually compiled by the squadron leader, and they are typed entries on large kind of A3 landscape format sheets. Some people might have already looked at them before, and they're absolutely fascinating. And you have to realize that, of course, they are, busy mid-ranking officers that have got various things to do, and at the end of the day they type up the stuff which gives you everything from weather reports to who beat who in the inter-squadron football matches and things like that. So you get references that are tantalizing and they take you places and you think, that's interesting. So yes, they did, and actually it was only relatively late in preparing this talk because it wasn't really covered in the research that I'd done for my private publication, that I looked into the specific point around the aviation work. So those references that I made at the end to the BAC work, the work on the Lightning, the work on the Concorde, there are very explicit links that they've drawn through from certainly from the captured individuals to the development of British both civil and military aviation. There are no specific mentions of plans per se around that in the ORB because that's kind of a bit too detailed for that source. But certainly what is clear is that the combined richness of individuals, because they interviewed Richard Vogt, who was the head of design at Blom and Voss. He designed all of their flying boats pretty much during the war. He was interviewed by a BIOS subcommittee, so they got everything they needed from him. They got all of the equipment out of Blom and Voss's works, and you could put all of that together, and if you combine the intelligence, the individuals, and in many cases the equipment. I mean, one of the pictures I didn't include in the slide pack in the end, there's great pictures of the Bedford wind tunnels being built in the 1950s, all from stuff that they'd pinched from the Germans. And some of them were still working. Some of the wind tunnels were still working into the 80s and 90s. That's quite impressive. So the answer is yes. And I can provide people with some links to some bits and bobs, probably through yourself, Harry, if that's possible and if that's something they would like.
Yeah, well, I think we'll give you the chance to plug your blog as well. Hopefully, it will encourage you to expand the military history section on it.
I knew you were going to say that because I was going to say that it'd be great if you're into architecture and films and TV. But well, it's been nice to get this reaction because it's as we talked about the other day, Harry. It's it's something that I found myself drawn back to. It's something I've always been interested in, but something I've been drawn back to in the last few years. So yeah, who knows?
That's great. I should say I find the point on the wind tunnels particularly interesting because, of course, there was a sort of shortage of that kind of resource before the war, and so it's interesting to see how it feeds in. That's one of the things they're really keen to grab hold of.
Yeah, I think what was particularly interesting, I nearly mentioned it in the lecture, but you kind of have to draw a line somewhere, is one of the things you do find, and this is why I think the whole idea of the BIOS investigations, there's a fantastic guy who's got an online index of all of the BIOS reports. There's about 400 of them or something. And crucially, he's got PDF scans of a lot of them, which is great. And because they had subject-specific experts like Buchanan from Shorts going into Blom and Voss, you got very informed comment and criticism rather than just, uninformed general individuals. So it was very clear that with things like the wind tunnels, but also with some of the other things. So Blom and Voss, for example, when you design a boat or a flying boat, doesn't really matter because the shape's the same. There's this process called lofting, which is how you turn a two-dimensional design into a three-dimensional hull. And you kind of think that'd be simple, but it's not. It's actually incredibly hard. And they were really, really impressed with Blom and Voss's approach to that. They used this fantastic photographic rig, which kind of enabled them to create sort of 3D plans and things like that. And that was completely unknown to what we were doing in England. And you see that again and again coming out through the BIOS reports, through some of the comments from other sources, where, as you say, they were, the broad thrust seems to be that, and some of the more recent researchers have been making these conclusions, that it really does kind of prove the old stereotype that the Brits were very much a kind of make, do and mend approach. They kind of took a particular item or a technique or a process and kind of pushed it to the nth degree and got the most out of it possible. And that was enough to get us through. The Germans took a different approach. They threw a lot of money at it, came up with new techniques and did stuff that way. And it was quite interesting, obviously, after the war, when the two could be put together and you could see the advantages perhaps of both sides.
I have to resist just hogging this Q&A and go back to our audience. So one of the questions we've had is from Grayson Myers. It's for the RAF, what were the most valuable findings about the Luftwaffe learned during the disarmament process?
That's an interesting one. I think the difficulty is that if you look at it through the angle of the disarmament wings, they were much more looking at the detritus in the nicest possible sense, because I think you won't see from the wings things like intelligence work on debriefing flyers and things like that. So for them, it was less about what you could learn from them as an opposing force and more about how you could control this chaotic mess that 6 years of war had ended up with. So I think you would probably need to look further into things like what were the results of the interrogations of captured aircrew, and certainly from generals, and the sorts of things that they were coming up with, than into the ORB work particularly, because again, the ORB work the armament disarmament wing work was a mixture of capturing the targets that they've been ordered to capture, securing those targets, dealing with the displaced people, dealing with the POWs, which was a massive issue and becomes more so certainly through the end of 45 and beginning of 46. Facilitating those investigations, whether it is through intelligence groups or through private companies, and kind of just getting through it all. So I think it's a good question, and you don't really get a huge sense of that beyond the things that I've pulled out in the presentation, which, bear in mind, it brings together a range of different sources itself. So you're looking at the ORBs to give the direct experience, the oral testimonies, which are really helpful, and then looking at the intelligence reports. And I think the next step up, which I talked about, is the intelligence reports, where you start to see what was valuable to specific companies. The problem is that most of that, it was so fragmented because it was in very, very specific things. I mean, there are sort of crazily specific bits of technology that people were interested in. I think if you were looking at seeing, for example, how the strategy worked, how the warfighting strategy worked, you would have to look slightly higher and in a slightly different place, which is why I think, and again, it was a relatively late finding on my part, that the whole issue around the formation of the post-war Bundeswehr is really, really interesting, because I'll be honest, I hadn't realized how they went, how do you reform a peacetime air force when you've just spent 6 years fighting the same, effectively, air force? And there are some really extraordinary individuals that they pulled in and were running the Bundeswehr for the first few years, for the 50s, 60s, 70s, all of whom, some were ex-Nazis, but, only the kind of softer side of Nazis, because the ones that were really Nazis, they didn't want. So I think it's a really interesting question. I think you would probably need to go slightly higher and at a slightly different angle to try and collate some of those sources, because the sort of thing that I've been looking at is probably a bit too kind of granular for that.
It's a difficult point, isn't it? When
yeah, it is.
Taking these people in, and I can't remember his name now, but V2 rocket designer is a sort of classic example of this.
Yeah,
personally horrific.
Yeah, and there was I'd need to kind of go aside and Google it again, but there was a terrific site that I found the other day that talked you through the sort of top 5 or 6 Luftwaffe officers that formed the Bundeswehr, and some of them extraordinary. One of them was, I think, the second highest scoring ace of all time. There was a guy, he'd fought through the whole war, he'd been shot down several times. His last work was flying Me-262s, and he was involved in this horrific crash of a 262 on takeoff, and he was badly burned. But he came back, and he was one of the most senior officers in West Germany after the war.
I think it's Krupinski who you're thinking of.
Sure.
But let's crack on. We've got a question about the flying helmets that you mentioned.
Oh, yeah.
During the talk. Can you say a little bit more about them?
Very little without digging into the reference, unfortunately. It's just that it was such a kind of mundane thing. I thought, why was this even worth recording? But it was interesting that the word novel came up, because I don't profess to be an expert on 1945 era flying equipment, but I was interested in the range and variety of material that was secured through the wing, and how valuable people thought all this was and why. And it was very clear that this idea of summer weight flying helmets was not something that most other air forces were familiar with. So the fact that they actually thought that was A, worth logging, and B, worth seizing and taking back to England, I thought was quite remarkable. I suppose in a way you could say there was a sort of vague parallel with the opposite, which was the heated flying suits that the US Army Air Force developed for the B-17 door gunners. So I guess you could say it's kind of the flip side of that. And I think that's why it was interesting that Travemünde was interested in so much stuff. I mean, insofar as people know it at all, it's known for the amphibious aircraft sphere. But the fact that they did everything, and I didn't even mention all of it, but the things that sounded quite interesting that I mentioned, and also the whole thing about the camouflage atlas, I thought that was fascinating. The idea that this ultra secret test center was also patiently designing the camouflage patterns for all the Luftwaffe aircraft. I thought that was great. I mean, clearly, that was I made it clear that was the official line. I think most people who are familiar with the subject know that a lot of staffels and so on came up with their own camouflage, but I just thought that was really interesting. And they worked with the paint manufacturers, and they worked with the high command to make sure that this was all promulgated across the whole of the Luftwaffe.
Okay, so we've got a question from Gary Willis, which is regarding the scrapping of material, which you mentioned. Can you say a bit more about this? Was it a systematic part of the process on the part of the RAF disarmament wings?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was what's interesting, because I've often thought when you look around museums today, I think on the one hand, it's sort of striking that there's so much stuff left. But actually, when you think about it, no, what's really striking is that there's so little left. The ME-109 was the most manufactured. It was the most numerate aircraft of the war. They made 33,000 of them. How many are left in the world? There's only one Typhoon left in the world. And the answer is that that's because they smashed up almost all of it. And the ORBs list in mind-numbing detail every single day and every single month what they've been collecting, where they find it, what they did with it. Sometimes they had to seek approval, but in a lot of cases, it was absolutely a systematic part of their job. So the phrase concentration was used because that's what they did. So at Priwall, they would bring it all together. They seized aero engines. They tell you the caliber of the ammunition that they find. So they find, several hundred weight of 20mm cannon shells, all that kind of stuff. The airframes themselves, everything. And they brought it all together and they just crushed it and chucked it in the water most of the time, or buried it in landfill, or burned it. It's slightly disturbing that they burned so much stuff. A lot of the ordnance was dumped at sea, which is also disturbing in a whole range of ways. But yeah, it was absolutely a systematic part of their job. And it's quite interesting because you kind of get the impression, depending on how you look at it, that it really was about the word is a good one, systematically destroying everything. So it really was kind of like wiping it off the face of the map and getting rid of all of the aircraft and everything. Some of the aircraft were kept. I mean, I almost put this in the presentation, but I kind of assumed people might think it was made up. They spent about a year assembling a Ju-52 from all of the bits that they found. And they eventually, after about a year and a half, put it all together and flew it out of Travemünde-Priwall, which I thought was quite sweet. And it kind of, British men are good at that sort of thing, fiddling with an old car in their workshop for many years and eventually driving it away. And I thought it was quite remarkable you could do that with a World War II German transport plane as well.
So Gary's question goes on a little bit. It's regarding the export of scrap from Germany to Britain. I feel I'm possibly putting you on rocky ground here.
I think that might be a slight conflation, possibly on my part. The scrap was scrapped on site. The stuff they exported was the stuff they wanted to keep. So the aircraft that they flew out, some were flown back to England. A lot were shipped back to England because I think I saw very briefly in the comments, which I'll enjoy reading later. Again, hopefully without digressing too much, so bring me back if I am. But the stuff that they kept, you have to bear in mind that a lot of the work that people like Eric Brown did and the other test pilots was genuinely dicey, because a lot of the aircraft that were assembled in Germany during the war were assembled in haste. A lot of the prototypes were prototypes. They hadn't been, properly tested and flown. Many of there's a separate sub story about the forced labourers that were assembling FW-190s at Travemünde. That's why there was an FW-190 in that picture with the Viking. And it was well known that they used to sabotage some of the aircraft. So the job of the test pilots was, a significant risk. And somebody mentioned that Eric Brown's book does mention a lot of the work that he did. He flew the BV-222 himself, along with lots of other aircraft. I mean, it's probably worth saying on that point that there was a really sad story that I found from the ORB, which was a really good example of something that you could pull out a name, follow it through, and work out what happened. Some people might be familiar with the Dornier Do-335 file. It was the fastest turboprop aircraft in the world during the war. It's the one with the pusher and the puller props. And one of those is recorded in the ORB as being flown out by a group captain, Hards. Well, I looked him up, and he was a well-known test pilot, Alan Hards. He was the chief test pilot at Farnborough after the war, and later it wasn't the Do-335. He flew another aircraft out. Later, he was test piloting Do-335, which may well have been the one that's in that picture of the Farnborough show, because there weren't many made, because it never properly entered service. He was flying it out of Farnborough, and it crashed on landing. He just hit a school kind of by accident. He was killed. Nobody else at the school was hurt. He was about 31 years old or something like that. So it gives you an idea of how dangerous it really was.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about Travemünde, whether or not what were the personnel there doing when they weren't working? And I want to ask you this because they built an aircraft. Was this their spare time?
No, that was the RAF guys did that after the war.
Yeah, but the nudist beast wasn't there at the time. So what did they have to do when they weren't working?
So you're talking about our guys in the occupation. Oh, they did lots of stuff. They're playing their football. They got occasional 24-hour passes to go into town, so they went into Hamburg and things like that. There was a lot of mate work, I suspect, but in terms of the sort of happy stuff, yeah, they did everything that you would do on an English camp. So they had dances, they had games, evenings, and lots of football. There's a lot of references to football and about how we sort of sadly lost or we won or this kind of stuff. I'm assuming it was the officers, but there's more than one reference to them going game shooting with captured shotguns. And they actually, and this probably doesn't surprise anyone, they actually list the sort of thing that they're killing when they do their game shooting, which I thought was quite amusing. So, as I said in the presentation, they're kind of making the best of what they've got. I mean, my dad used to talk, not a lot, but he used to talk, notably about, he was an 18, 19-year-old on this huge, big seaplane base with, everything that you could imagine that was there. And so they did a lot of mucking around. That was one of the things that comes across quite clearly. I'm not sure whether it was in England or in Germany, but they used to make vermin traps out of detonators and tin cans. And it's kind of a miracle that more people weren't injured, frankly, when you think of the sort of stuff that they were doing. I mean, it's a sad story, but that death of an unfortunate shooting incident, what does that mean exactly? There's no detail, but that was quite touching, actually, as you probably could tell when I said it, because I was quite surprised, actually, at my reaction to that, even though I've written it and read it several times. But, I think the No.8401 Wing lost about 8 men killed over that period. That's quite surprising when you think about it. Some of it's quite, again, mundane and quite kind of sad. But, and the UXB one is particularly striking, I think. They were 24 and 25 years old. They were killed. The disarmament wings had bomb disposal kind of subgroups attached to them as well that were obviously specifically tasked with defusing UXBs. And that's what happened in that particular case. Both of them are buried in Germany.
We've had a few questions with the same sort of theme, which is whether or not for work of the disarmament wings was happening in other countries as well. So Japan is one that springs to mind.
Yeah, and I honestly don't know the answer. I would assume so, yes, because, and I think as you asked earlier, it's not clear to what extent, why did the RAF own the disarmament mission in Germany as opposed to, other parts of the Allies. And it's clear that they did divide up pretty much all of Germany. Although that said, there's no reference to Tarnowitz. Tarnowitz was one of the other E-Stellers, and that was only a few miles east from Travemünde. It's not mentioned anywhere. I'm assuming it's because it fell into the Russian zone. So whether the RAF was covering everything outside the Russian zone or whether the Americans were doing their own bit, I don't know. And so as far as things like other belligerent nations are concerned, I mean, there must have been a fair amount of disarmament to do in Italy as well, for example, up to the point where they obviously changed sides. So, yeah, I think that would be a really interesting point of future research. I think, as I suspect the questioner probably knows, the whole of the Far East campaign is generally regarded as less explored and certainly less publicly known than the Western Europe campaign. So I think that would potentially be quite a fruitful area of investigation.
You mentioned that there were some other test centres. 4. This was one of 4. So can you tell us a little bit more about the other 3?
Yeah, so you had Rechlin was the prime test centre, which was kind of the equivalent of RAE Farnborough broadly. The remains of it are open today as a museum, and that was where most of the kind of general Luftwaffe research took place. And it was interesting how the 4 of them did kind of tend to deal with specialist areas. So you had Rechlin as the chief test centre. That's where Buss, the parachute guy, worked. So that was the kind of main point. Travemünde was obviously, as I've said, it was the amphibious specialist as well as the other things that they did. Further on the coast was Tarnowitz, which was the armaments and ordnance research base. That used to be done at Rechlin, but they parceled it off. That's quite an interesting one in itself. They created a complete artificial peninsula, which you can see very clearly from the air. And that was where they tested everything, the guns, the bombs, the missiles, the rockets, all the kind of clever stuff that they were doing later in the war about, automatically photo cell firing guns so that you could fly under a British bomber and the guns would just fire and destroy the bomber. So that was Tarnowitz. And probably the best known one is the Luftwaffe half of Peenemünde, which was Peenemünde West. So as is probably well known, part of the difficulty with the whole kind of war fighting ability of Germany was that it was split through rivalry between the different branches, as well as rivalries within the branches. But yeah, there was the Luftwaffe half of Peenemünde, and then the army half of Peenemünde, which is why the V1 and the V2 were developed at the same place, one as an army weapon, one as a Luftwaffe weapon. And I think, again, that's interesting as well, that it's really important to point out that, as I was trying to say in the presentation, that most of what was done at those E-Stellers, the Allies didn't know what was being done there. They only knew afterwards. And that was why this was such a surprise of all of it. And that's why I think Travemünde has such an interesting history as well, because even if you exclude the whole Cold War thing, it was like the Croydon of its day. It was a hugely busy international, and it's fantastic. Some of the stuff in that kind of golden age of aviation, they were doing all kinds of stuff there, quite advanced. And I showed that just in a couple of the pictures, but these big 12-engine flying boats and flying off down to South America, in the early 1920s and all this kind of stuff. But for that then to change so suddenly and to do all this work. So Peenemünde, for example, they were bombing Peenemünde, the Allies, before they even knew what was there. They just knew that something was going on there. It's kind of a bit of a miracle that Travemünde survived, actually, because it did get attacked, and there are records of it being defended with flak. There are images of bomb damage on some of the runways, but considering what was going on there, they didn't really get particularly touched.
So I think we've got time for one more question, and it's quite a nice one. Has your research turned up any cases of marriage between men from the 8401 Wing and local German women?
No, nothing specific, and I rather suspect that wouldn't have been reflected in the ORB anyway. That's why I think that whole story about the Christmas Eve dance, I think, was a beautiful story. Yeah, the whole fraternization thing is interesting because the Americans were quite keen on the non-fraternization policy. So was Montgomery. And again, it was fairly well known that just through sheer pragmatism and, common sense, it was gradually reduced and reduced and reduced. So no, nothing specific, sadly. There was much more in the RBs about people flying home to be discharged or to be demobilized or to get promoted or to do all that kind of stuff. Yeah, it would be interesting to speculate, but I would probably draw a line on that.
Okay, well, that's a nice point to end on. I should say, if anyone in the audience is interested, Patrick Major gave a talk at our conference where he touched on some of the other work that the Allies did with Luftwaffe scientists. In this case, it was with the research into the stratosphere. So very interesting topic. It was covered in our conference. So if you're interested, you can find that either via Crowdcast or probably more easily on YouTube. But all that's really left now, Chris, is me to thank you for a brilliant lecture and thank you for being so generous with your time.
No, not at all. Thank you for everyone for your wonderfully positive comments, which I'm again sort of catching out of the corner of my eye, and I hope to be able to review those later. That's it's very touching. So thank you.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you again, and thank you for everyone who's joined us. I hope you all have a good night. Goodbye.